The prisoner's dilemma is one of, if not the fundamental issue in political science, political philosophy, and moral philosophy. Most ideologies and most worldviews are attempts to kind of come to terms with it. Obviously, they're more complicated than that, but there's always an aspect of trying to resolve the prisoner's dilemma in one way or another at the core of any ideology. So, what is the prisoner's dilemma? The prisoner's dilemma is based on the idea that in most cases, cooperating is a good thing. In most cases, working together is a good thing. But in practice, it's very difficult. It's difficult for a number of reasons. One, you can never really know what other people are thinking. Also, there's an assumption to assume that people will act in their rational self-interest. And while you might think the rational self-interest is everyone cooperating, there are costs to cooperating when other people don't cooperate that make it, at least from some perspectives, more rational to take the suboptimal solution of throwing the other person under the bus rather than trying to cooperate and achieving a better result as a result of working together. I think the best way to define it and how most people go through this is to provide examples. There's a number of related concepts, such as the tragedy of the commons or the free rider problem. Now, the tragedy of the commons we'll get to in a minute, but let's just kind of go through the most basic example of the prisoner's dilemma and where the title comes from. Okay, so you have two people who have been captured. They're both in jail, they're both in police custody, and the police come to both of them with a deal. They say, look, if you testify, we'll reduce your sentence. Now, what the two people don't know is that all the evidence that the police have is based on the testimony of one or two of them. So the police have very little evidence, maybe only enough to charge them of a lesser crime, if they don't get testimony. So in an ideal world, both people would keep their mouths shut and they get like a minor jail sentence or no jail sentence at all. And that would be great. That would be the best possible outcome. But here's the issue. If the other person confesses, if the other person testifies against you, you're going to get, this is one example, there's numerous different ratios, but you get the idea. You get out of jail, or you maybe only get, in some examples, 3 years in jail. And the other person will get 10 years in jail. So that's very attractive because you can't tell what the other person's going to do. So what kind of the rational thing is, I might as well just go after them. Because if I don't go after them and they go after me, then I'll spend 10 years in jail. Whereas if I go after them and they don't, then I'll only spend 3 years in jail. And that's a huge difference of time. And then the scenario of both sides rat on each other, they'll both get 5 years. But to a lot of people, the idea of taking a chance between 5 or 0 years is better than taking a chance on getting 1 or 0 years. Because by taking the confession, you at least are not going to get that max sentence. So for a lot of people, that seems like the optimal thing. Now the version of this I prefer that I had trouble finding is if both cooperate, they get no time in jail. Sorry, if neither of them rat on each other, they get 0 time in jail. If both of them rat on each other, they get 5 years. If one rats on the other, they get 3 years, etc. So the idea would be, the ideal situation would be they both don't rat on each other. But the idea is they're taking a suboptimal solution as a guarantee. And this is very commonly used in fiction. Probably one of the best examples, which is more or less exactly this, was in The Dark Knight, where the Joker has the two boats, one with the criminals and one with the normal people, and he gives them both detonators. So in this case, the best example, which is the best outcome, which is what happened, is neither side presses the button. Neither side blows the other up. Everything works out for the best. But is that really the rational thing to do? Because if you press the button, you'll have the guilt of killing the other people, but you're certainly going to make it out of the situation alive. So the rational thing would just be to push the button. But the movie was trying to make a point that humanity isn't as bad as the Joker thinks it is, so they didn't wind up pushing the button. So before we get into some of the more political applications of this, let's talk about a related concept called the tragedy of the commons. So the tragedy of the commons is that you can benefit from a public good without contributing to it or even exploiting it. Once again, this is a little hard to explain, so let's give some examples. Littering is a good example of this. You litter in a public space. You dump your trash in the river, you dump your trash in the park. It's probably not going to make any difference. If you throw a bag of garbage in the river every week, it's probably never going to affect you. But if everybody did it, it would create like a pandemic. It would be utterly devastating to the environment. But most people are reasonably sure that not everyone's going to do it. So there's other things like paying your taxes. If nobody paid taxes, the government would collapse and we'd have anarchy as a society. But if you as an individual evade taxes, then it's probably going to work out. Some other good examples of the tragedy of the commons are overfishing, particularly what China and Japan and those countries do, where they'll just overfish various parts of the world. And obviously this is leading to a decline of global fish stocks and an environmental disaster. But it's rational for the individual countries because they're grabbing the resources up before other people do. That's another kind of aspect of it. And once again, where the two kind of meet is where you might as well grab it first because you don't know if the other person's going to grab it. So even if it's not particularly useful or important, denying that to the other person is often the better idea. And I think that's what happened a lot with colonies, is countries didn't necessarily want them. In a lot of cases, they were a massive drain on resources, but there was a fear that another great power would get their hands on them and be successful at exploiting them. So people were just trying to scramble to grab everything. The ideal situation in probably most cases would have been to not colonize any of the countries and just trade with them. But there was concerns that someone would then be able to just grab everything and they'd become a superpower and just overrun everybody else with like another example of this would be the partition of Poland, where Maria Theresa was very strongly against it. But when it turned out it was inevitable, she grabbed part of Poland too, because there was no real reason not to. She could take the moral high ground, but her opponents were not going to take the moral high ground. So she might as well take some of it too. Otherwise, she'd be at a disadvantage because she wouldn't get additional territory and population. So probably the most common place where this is used in modern, let me just switch this. The most probably common modern place we see the prisoner's dilemma used is in the field of international relations. Now I have to read up about it again. I studied this a lot in university, but just to get my head around it. International relations is very interesting because there's a set of ideological positions in it, but it's asynchronous. It's not necessarily related to, how should we say it, normal political ideologies. For instance, neoconservatism is a form of liberal internationalism. And more kind of, I guess, what we call right wing, be they far right or dissident right, or just kind of that sort of thing, more fit into kind of the critical theory box along with like feminism and Marxism than do other things. Traditionally, in a very, very loose sense, the right prior to neoconservatism was associated with realism, and the left and center was associated with liberalism. So very briefly, the two kind of biggest camps we have is realism and liberalism. Realism is the idea that you can't know what other people are thinking. With regards to the prisoner's dilemma, they take the position you should always rat on the other person. There's no reason not to. That you can never count on, that people will selfishly act in their own best interests. And so the only thing you can do to counter this is to act in your best interest. And hopefully to act in your best interest first and harder than the other person does. They see the international system as being inherently anarchic. So let's just read it because there's a good definition here. For realists, the prisoner's dilemma defines life in the international system. Outcomes are zero sum, the world is anarchic, and self help is necessary. That is, even with your allies, you don't know if they're just going to leave you, you don't know if they're going to throw you under the bus. So the only thing you can trust is yourself and to a certain extent your people. So the power of your state is what comes first. The power of your military, your economy is primary. Also, politics is inherently amoral. And realism was the guiding philosophy of American politics during the Cold War, more or less. Wilson was a liberal, and the neoconservatives are liberals. But during much of the Cold War era, you saw the U.S. back up people who are ideologically opposed to them, sometimes socialists, fascists, all kinds of people who they ideologically disagree with. But it made sense if you're just looking at it from a rational, realpolitik perspective. So so states are trapped in the security dilemma, so they pursue power for self-protection. So here's kind of another basically different way of wording the prisoner's dilemma. So the security dilemma is, it would be better if everybody just held hands and sung Kumbaya. Weapons are expensive. They don't really have a direct economic application. I mean, some countries like Russia or the US make a lot of money by selling them, but in and of themselves, a tractor is better than a tank in terms of producing actual useful goods for society. So it is kind of a drain in a lot of cases on a country's resources. And the dilemma, though, is if you decide to not invest in weapons and stuff, and other countries do, then you're screwed. And this is what happened numerous times with the neutral states, is a lot of them were just not able to or are not willing to, like Holland and these Norway and Denmark, they weren't able to, or they didn't have the ability to invest as much in the military as the great powers did. And so they were just steamrolled. There was nothing really they could do about it. So you can kind of, and that's kind of another thing, like I said in a previous video about China. China has never really wanted to put much money into its army, so it always gets steamrolled, more or less. Most of the time when it's invaded by a foreign power, because the money goes into civilian government, which is good for the Chinese people, but it's bad for the ability of China to survive as an independent power. And probably kind of the best example of the security dilemma was the arms race that we had during the Cold War. So the idea was, if the Soviets had a bigger army, then they'd be in a situation of an advantage. And if the Cold War turned hot, then they'd be in the better position. So the U.S. had to constantly develop weapons, and the Soviet Union had to constantly develop weapons. And kind of what Reagan's strategy was, is he realized that the overall capacity of the Soviet Union to develop new weapons was less than the U.S.'s. So he just drove it up, and up. He dramatically increased military spending, and the Soviet Union was unable to keep up with it. And so he kind of used the security dilemma as a weapon. Nuclear weapons were another thing where both sides just felt that having more was better. So they built an absurd number of them, and they had like I forget what they're called, MIRVs or whatever. Just the idea to put in as much as possible, and then to research things like first strike capacity, shooting down missiles, etc. And once again, and kind of eventually you kind of had a bit of an inverse of the prisoner's dilemma when you start to have nuclear arms limitation. And maybe it'll strike people as weird, but I actually do support nuclear disarmament down to the absolute minimum, because it can potentially blow the world up. So it would be good for everybody if most nuclear weapons, at least strategic ones, maybe I think tactical ones are okay to keep around, but if they were reduced to a point where there wasn't a danger of like the world's environment being destroyed if they were used. But so that would be good for everybody if we didn't have that, but it makes rational sense to pursue nuclear weapons. Like in the case of India and Pakistan, if the other one has it, they might as well have it too. Sure, it creates the situation where they can both completely annihilate each other and makes the whole thing worse, But you can't take that risk. If Pakistan gets them, despite their much weaker army, they might be able to invade India. And same thing, India might be able to win a war against Pakistan. I mean, they could win either, anyways, but without like losing tens of millions of people in a bloody slugfest. So that's kind of what it comes down to for realists. You have to grab resources first. You have to assume people are against you. Politics is a zero-sum game. Someone always wins and someone always loses. You can't have a scenario in which both sides win. So that's the game that realists play. Okay, so then we have the alternative that emerged in opposition to realism. Maybe I'm going into this more than I need to, but it interests me. So liberalism is the belief that the prisoner's dilemma can be overcome. So they have a number of reasons for thinking this. Some of them reasonable, some of them not. Part of it is they think people are capable of acting in their rational best interest. That you can be made to understand that, hey, if we work together, things are going to be better. Sometimes trade agreements are good, peace is good, that sort of thing. It can be very naive, but it also does work in some cases because people, generally speaking, don't want war. They don't want their countries to get destroyed. Part of this is to just have very open communications between states. You know how in movies they always have the red phone on the desk between the Kremlin and the White House. They're like, that's a good thing. Leaders should be talking to each other. There should be openness. They should, part of the whole nuclear arms limitation thing is they allow people to inspect their facilities so that they can make sure that they're not doing it in secret. So that's it. They like laws. They like treaties. They like things like the UN or international energy or some sort of thing that can kind of bind everybody together. And that's kind of one of the reasons governments are created as a way of forcing a solution to the prisoner's dilemma by using force. Because like if some people sped, it might not be bad for them, but if everybody sped, it would be a disaster. So government comes into existence to regularize these things, to say, okay, we're just going to impose punishments on people to force, I guess you could say, social behavior, because we live in a society. And to that end, that's kind of the point. Once again, laws against damaging the environment, laws against things like shoplifting. It might not destroy the company if one person does it, but if everybody does it, it's going to be a mess. And to a certain extent, that's why the state exists, to force collective action. The liberals, though, some other things that they have is technology is another one. Is with advantages in advancement in technology, you don't have issues like mass starvation, at least theoretically. We can grow enough food to feed everybody. Countries can create synthetic materials. Transportation is better, etc. So that removes a lot of the onus. You get less of a benefit to turning on the other person. You get less of a benefit for invading another country. Once again, things like sanctions, things like mutual defense treaties, the idea is to make the costs of turning the other person in so high that no one will want to do it. And there's realists also have this idea, but liberals take a much more cooperative standpoint to it. Another thing, and this is why liberals were so keen to embrace free trade, is the idea is if countries are economically dependent upon each other, they won't go to war. So if one country is completely dependent on oil from another country, the thought process was they wouldn't invade that country because it would cut off the oil, which proved to be not really true, but it's an interesting theory. So that's the kind of the two main ways of looking at the prisoner's dilemma in kind of a meta sense, in the way that we look at the world. And it's very fascinating, to be honest. It is one of the foundational aspects. Is Marxism, liberalism, conservatism, fascism, all these different ideologies, a core part of it is trying to solve the prisoner's dilemma. I mean, even within Christianity, you have the golden rule, treat your neighbor as you would treat yourself, as you would want to be treated. And that is a solution to the prisoner's dilemma. And it's on this one, it's very easy to be very cynical and just say the realists are 100% right. But at the same time, that can create a society and a world order that's very dangerous. And maybe another good example of this was the European Union, which is kind of the ultimate liberal project, was to create an interdependent series of countries subject to a central body that had kind of a shared army. The EU was in part sponsored by sponsored by the U.S. and a lot of other kind of minor powers because people were tired of Germany and France going to war with each other every 30 years and dragging the entire world into it. Because you had like the Franco-Prussian War, you had the Napoleonic Wars, you had World War One, World War Two, and people were just sick of it. So the EU was kind of a liberal solution for that. So you can like or hate the EU, but you can't argue that it hasn't, at least in my opinion, you can't argue that it hasn't made like military conflict between different European states more difficult. And then you get into things like trade-offs. Is a war is more kind of continual warfare between the different European powers better or worse than whatever the EU does? And I think these are very difficult questions, and they aren't really as easy to answer as we might think. So I've rambled on long enough. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something, and I'll talk to you guys